Hello and welcome to this series of training videos on measuring performance in the public sector. My name is Mark Robinson and these videos are brought to you by the European Union. The basic aim of these videos is to present the foundations of public sector performance measurement. They do that firstly by presenting the key concepts of the public sector results chain. That is, the concepts of outcomes, outputs, activities and inputs. And secondly, by defining and providing examples of the types of performance indicators which are most useful in reporting public sector performance. Performance measurement is of fundamental importance in government. The better we can measure performance, the better we can manage it. In this session, we're going to talk about outputs and output indicators. Outputs is a general concept that applies both in the public sector and the private sector. It simply refers to the goods and services that organisations deliver. In a private sector context, outputs means the goods or services that a company delivers to its customers, so that the outputs of a car company are simply the cars that it sells to drivers. In the case of government, outputs refers to goods or services which ministries or agencies deliver to external clients. Very often, those external clients are citizens who directly receive a service. So, for example, when a public hospital treats a patient, that patient is directly receiving a service, an output. The same is true in a primary school. The school kid who is being taught is directly receiving that educational output or service. But sometimes the client of an output is the community as a whole. So when a jail keeps a prisoner incarcerated, it's not the prisoner who's receiving the service, it's a service that's being delivered to the community as a whole to keep it safe. As these examples indicate, in government, most of the outputs that we deliver are services rather than physical goods. A key point about outputs is that when we talk about outputs, we always mean services which ministries or agencies deliver to external clients, that is, to clients outside the ministry or agency. Sometimes this can mean services delivered to other ministries or agencies. But crucially, when we're talking about internal services, in other words, services that one part of a ministry might deliver to another part of that ministry, such as human resources management or IT support, those sort of internal services are never considered to be outputs. Outputs is a concept that is reserved for services delivered to external clients. Well, having discussed outputs, we turn now to output performance indicators. And we have to start by being clear about what a performance indicator is. A performance indicator is a measure of some aspect of performance. For example, a measure of the number of farmers provided with technical assistance by Ministry of Agriculture officers during the year, or the rate of murders that are solved by the police during the year. Or at a higher level, an indicator such as life expectancy at birth of the population. Because indicators are measures, they're also often referred to as performance measures, a term that means exactly the same thing. There are many types of performance indicators. In addition to output indicators, there are indicators of outcomes, activities, and inputs. But in this first presentation, we're going to focus exclusively on output indicators. There are three basic types of output indicators. There are indicators of output quantity, indicators of output quality, and indicators of output efficiency. And in what follows, we're going to discuss each of these three types of output indicators in turn. Let's start with output quantity indicators. These are measures of the number or volume of services provided to clients. For example, one of the important outputs delivered by the Ministry for Foreign Affairs is the issuing of visas. So an important output quantity indicator here would be a measure of the number of visa applications processed by the ministry during the year. In a schooling context, output quantity is measured by the number of students who attend school for the year. In a hospital context, measuring output quantity means measuring the number of treatments which the hospital delivers to patients. And the most useful way of doing this is to report these treatments by diagnosis, by the type of problem that the patient is suffering from. So one such measure would be a measure of the number of asthma patients treated on an inpatient basis during the year. Another would be the number of heart attack patients treated in the hospital during the year. Now, these are all examples of what we could call raw output quantity measures. They simply report the volume of services delivered. Another type of output quantity measure is a measure that reports on the equity in service delivery. For example, let's suppose that the country has a problem with female access to schools in rural areas, that girls tend to attend school at lower rates than boys in those rural areas. Well, in that context, a very useful equity measure would be a measure of the school attendance rate of girls divided by the school attendance rate of boys in rural areas. If that performance indicator has a value of 0.5, what that's telling you is girls in rural areas only attend school to half the extent that boys do, indicating that there is a major equity problem in access to this very important service. The objective, of course, is that this indicator should have a value of 1, indicating that girls have the same access to schooling as boys. So this is, again, an output quantity indicator, but it's a measure of equity in the delivery of services to two different categories of client. Output efficiency indicators are the second type of output performance indicator. Now, when we talk about efficiency, what we mean is the production of an output at minimum cost to the public. That is, without, of course, sacrificing quality. So output efficiency indicators are simply measures of the resources that are used per unit of output delivered to clients. In principle, the most useful type of output efficiency measures are unit cost measures. In other words, measures which tell you how much it costs on average to deliver a unit of service. So in the context of visa applications, knowing what it costs on average to deliver a visa application can be a very useful measure. If it turns out, for example, that the average cost of processing a visa application is 40% higher this year than it was last year, then that raises real questions as to whether the service may be becoming less efficient. Another very useful example of a unit cost efficiency measure is the average cost of administering the set of childhood vaccinations that all children should receive. Now, although unit cost measures are in principle the most useful type of efficiency measure, in practice measuring unit cost is not an easy thing to do. It requires quite complicated managerial accounting, and there are very few countries in the world that can do this well. And it's for that reason that other types of output efficiency indicators can often be worth looking at. One of those is what's known as a labour productivity measure. A labour productivity measure is simply a measure of, on average, how much staff time input is required to deliver a unit of output. And an example would be the average number of hours of staff time taken per visa processed. Output quality indicators are the third type of output performance indicator. So what do we mean when we're talking about output quality? Well, we simply mean how good is the service that's being provided to the client. Let's take some concrete examples. In the context of education, when we talk about quality education, what we mean is that the teaching is good, that what the teacher is telling the kids is factually correct, that it's clear, understandable, and that the teaching methods that are being used are the most appropriate for the age category of the students concerned. When we talk about the quality of health treatments, what we mean is that the right treatment is being delivered given the patient's diagnosis, and that treatment is being delivered in a timely way. If we take the example of the fire service, when we're talking about a quality service, what we mean is that the fire brigade responds to fires quickly and it does its very best job to put the fires out. This is really no different than what we mean when we talk about the quality of a physical product. For example, when we talk about the quality of a car, we mean that it's well built so that it's mechanically reliable. We mean that it's safe. We mean that it's well finished. These are all attributes of that car that make it a quality product. So what about output quality indicators? Well, there are various dimensions of quality and therefore various types of output quality indicators. For services where it's important that the client receive the service quickly, a quality indicator which measures the waiting time, a timeliness indicator if you like, is really very useful indeed. For example, a common measure is the average time a patient waits at the accident and emergency centre of a hospital. If a patient arrives with a serious condition, it's important that they are treated quickly, and that's where this type of measure can be very handy. Similarly, if a small business needs a license to be able to start trading, it's important they are able to get a license quickly. So the average time before a license is issued by the government is a very important quality indicator. In many other areas of service provision, there's a right way and a wrong way of doing things. And if this is the case, then a useful type of quality indicator is an indicator which measures the extent to which the correct procedure is followed. Let's take an example. If a patient has surgery, there is a significant post-operative risk that they will develop a blood clot, and blood clots can be life-threatening. What that means is that after surgery, patients should be given anticoagulants, medications that prevent blood clots. So a very useful hospital performance indicator in this context is the percentage of surgical patients who receive such medications to prevent blood clots. That indicator should be 100%. If it's less than that, then you have a problem. It's exactly the same with another indicator used by hospitals, which is the proportion of patients who are diagnosed with pneumonia who receive antibiotics within a few hours of diagnosis. There's only one way of treating pneumonia, and that is with antibiotics. And all patients should receive antibiotics quickly, which makes this a very useful output quality indicator. Client satisfaction measures are the third and final type of output performance indicator. By a client satisfaction measure, we mean a measure of how good the client thinks the service was. For example, many universities systematically survey students as to their view of how good their lecturers are. Complaint statistics are often a very useful type of client satisfaction measure. An interesting type of client satisfaction measure that a number of governments use these days are measures of victim satisfaction with the police response to reported crimes. Suppose, for example, I'm the victim of a violent housebreaking. Criminals enter my home. They hold myself and my family hostage and threaten us. They take everything of value and do considerable damage to the house. This is the sort of violent crime that the police need to be taking very seriously. Now, as a victim of crime, I'm never going to know for sure how seriously the police investigate such a crime, but there are aspects of the police response that I'm in a very good position to judge. I will know whether the police responded quickly to the crime. It'll be very clear to me whether they seem to take the matter seriously. For example, whether they closely inspect the house for evidence such as fingerprints. And I will know whether down the track they made any contact with me to keep me posted on the state of the investigation or the outcome of the investigation. And all of these sorts of things mean that it is very useful to survey victims of crime about their level of satisfaction with the police response. Now, client satisfaction measures we're classifying here as output quality measures, but we have to acknowledge that many client satisfaction measures also, to some extent, measure outcomes. What do we mean by this? Well, if you survey hospital patients to ask them about the quality of the treatment that they received, how good the treatment was, their response will be partly influenced by whether the treatment was successful, and that's an outcome. So if we're going to be more precise about it, we would have to acknowledge that client satisfaction measures are in some cases measures of both output quality and outcomes. And we'll talk about outcomes in the next session. Well, that brings us to the end of our first session on outputs. As we've seen, outputs are services delivered by government ministries and agencies for external clients. There are three types of output indicator. The first are output quantity indicators, which measure the volume of services delivered for external clients. The second are output quality indicators, which measure how good the service is. And the third are output efficiency measures, which measure the resources used in producing outputs. But why is it that governments deliver outputs to the community? Well, it's to achieve what are known as outcomes. And outcomes are going to be the focus of our next session.